We're live.
Good evening, everyone in United States, and good morning, good day to everyone elsewhere in the world. We are here for our seminar series for the fellowship training program, Nanda Fellowship Training Program in Human Rights, on behalf of the ICHRRF. My name is Dr. Adityanji, and I am the President and Chairperson Board of Directors of the ICHRRF, which stands for the International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. We work towards the human rights and religious freedoms of persecuted minorities worldwide, groups that are marginalized and no one wants to talk about, we talk about them. So formally, on behalf of the Board of Directors and the executive team of the International Commission for Religious Freedom and Human Rights, I invite our audience to a special guest seminar in the ICHRRF Professor Ved P. Nanda Fellowship Training Program. These are our faculties. Currently, we have one fellow, Mr. Pachori. I'm not going to go about the standard format because we are not doing a standard seminar. It's a unique occasion. It's a historic occasion because for the first time, we have a guest faculty deliver a special lecture under the fellowship training program. And our guest speaker today is Dr. Richard Benkin, and he's going to be talking about USCIRF as an instrument of the United States State Department. Although you are seeing him, but I got this picture from the internet. Very handsome. A little bit about Dr. Richard Benkin. He's an international human rights author and advocate. He's going to be discussing today the USCIRF and its impact on the credibility of the human rights discourse. There are a lot of legitimate questions about the role, locus standi, and the purpose of USCIRF at this point in time. And I'm glad that we are going to hear this from a person of stature of Dr. Richard Benkin. He's a human rights activist in America, a journalist, a writer, a lecturer. He has a great deal of experience advising lawmakers and government agencies. He has done his seminal work on Bangladesh. US Congressperson Mark Kirk presented him with a certificate of special congressional recognition on May 22, 2005 at Benkin synagogue. So he's been a veteran championing the cause of Bangladeshi Hindu minorities. And I think it is very ironic that a Jewish American person is taking interest in the human rights and ethnic cleansing and persecution of a non-Abrahamic religious minority that is being persecuted by an Abrahamic sect. Dr. Benkin has also documented the present-day Hindu genocide happening in Bangladesh. In year 2012, he published a book called A Quiet Case of Ethnic Cleansing, the Murder of Bangladesh's Hindus. And I'm very proud to say that in December 2021, he was our first witness to testify under oath on a special hearing that was conducted on ethnic cleansing of Bangladesh minorities in Bangladesh. So this is the topic, and there are some housekeeping rules. I would like everyone to keep themselves on mute. I would advise people to change their cell phone to vibration modes. I would like no one to interrupt when Dr. Benkin is speaking. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to ask questions. We will not encourage any anonymous questioners, please. We would like you to send all your questions by the chat function. I would like our audience who ask questions to be very precise and very specific. Please don't give detailed comments in the form of a monologue. Just come to the point, ask the question to Dr. Benkin. And finally, as usual, like all our seminars, we record this, and then subsequently the recording is available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. So without further ado, I'm inviting Dr. Richard Benkin. The floor is yours, sir. Please go ahead, Dr. Benkin.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Good evening and namaskar. Before I go into my lecture, I do want to mention something based on what was it, about why a Jewish person took an interest and is fighting for Hindus. And I would say there are a number of reasons why I do this and a number of reasons why I started doing it. But I think for me personally, the most important thing that got me involved was most people, of course, everyone by now knows about the Holocaust against the Jewish people in Europe during World War II. And as a Jewish child growing up in the decades immediately afterwards, I learned very quickly that the Nazis weren't the real problems. Oh, certainly, there's a special place in hell for them, and I hope they're enjoying whatever eternal punishment they can get. However, the Nazis weren't the real problem because the Nazis could not have done it by themselves. The real problem in the Holocaust were all those good Europeans and others who sat by and did nothing, who closed their shutters so they didn't have to see their neighbors being dragged away in the night, who drove the trains to the death camps, and they were just taking care of their own. That was what allowed the Holocaust to happen. And the clarion cry that came out of the Holocaust was never again. And never again has two meanings. One is never again would we allow that to happen to us. And I think you see what's been with that. But the other is never again should we allow people to stand by and do nothing while a people, no matter who they are being brutalized, are being murdered. And so when I first became aware of what was happening to Hindus in Bangladesh, it activated that gene, if you will, where my immediate reaction was, well, if I don't do something about this, if I don't give myself over to it, how different am I than those who stood by while my relatives were taken to death camps? And that really was the first motivator that got me started. And so I just wanted to make that clear, because I really do believe, and you'll see this is my talk is going to have this suffused throughout. But I do believe that our great obligation as decent human beings is never to stand by while evil happens to others. And so for me, it takes a number of forms, but I've been involved in a lot of human rights struggles, but I am most closely associated with my fight to stop the ethnic cleansing of Hindus in Bangladesh. And in fact, I tell people that this fight in particular, this is my dharma. This is my dharma. This is what I'm here for. So without further ado, let me launch into my talk. Because you see, over the years, these human rights actions have led me to work in many different ways with the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, as it's called. And I've developed some pretty clear conclusions about that body, and I want to start off with my conclusions. First is that the creation of this body made a lot of sense. If we, and I'm talking about the United States in this case, if we truly are the bastion of freedom, if we are truly a beacon of hope for all people, we in fact should dedicate ourselves to helping those who are denied freedom. And having an agency devoted to that very thing is an important expression of that commitment. So I think the creation of USCIRF was a very, very good idea. But my second conclusion is that USCIRF is hopelessly biased. In particular, biased against non-Abrahamic faiths, or actually, to be more accurate, biased against non-Abrahamic faith, plus the first Abrahamic faith, that being Judaism. Because as you will see, USCIRF has never recommended sanctions against a country for religious persecution unless the victims included Muslims or Christians. That bias taints all that USCIRF does, and it calls into question its conclusions, even its accurate ones. And that actually hurts the entire human rights effort, because as we've seen it in so many cases, when people make false claims, it hurts those who have real claims to make, because again, it's all looked at askance. And so, as I said, this bias calls into question even the accurate thing that USCIRF might say. Now, I don't like projecting people's intentions without some solid basis to do so. So even if we take the most generous interpretation of this, I find it very disconcerting that a high-level body can have such a parochial understanding of religion and religious freedom. So that's my second conclusion. But my third conclusion is this, and here's the good news. In the end, it really doesn't matter all that much. For you see, USCIRF doesn't really have any teeth. Oh, it periodically will shake its fist and at something, and it will make recommendations that the State Department often ignores. And it does look away when there are facts that don't fit its narrative. But I warned that most Americans aren't even familiar with it. And its conclusions rarely make it to our media. For the most part, it talks to like-minded others and gets slammed in foreign media for its recommendations. And I want to emphasize again that USCIRF's authority extends only to making recommendations, never to making policy. And that's a very important thing to remember when we talk about USCIRF. Now, quite frankly, I hope that changes one day, certainly the bias, because I do believe that religious freedom is a core value for all of us. Well, my first contact with USCIRF came early in this century when I was fighting for the release of a Bangladeshi journalist. He was imprisoned and later tortured for urging Bangladeshi relations with Israel and for exposing the rise of radicalism in Bangladesh, especially through its madrasas or Muslim religious schools. That is, for doing his job. And I also want to be clear that this brave man was a Muslim. And I say this just in case there are any of us need reminders that courage and moral strength come in many forms and out of many faiths. Anyway, I was new to human rights activism when this happened. So I really grasped at whatever straws I could find, doing what I knew how to do. You know, I set out emails, I figured out who I could contact. Anyway, but it only made sense to me that I should look for help from an agency created specifically to promote religious freedom. Now, the people at USCIRF were very generous with their time, their verbal support, and I appreciated that. But you know what? In the end, it really didn't mean very much. We freed that man and won that fight and forced the Bangladeshi government to do something it didn't want to do, only because I figured out what they needed to fear. And none of it was anything USCIRF could do. I worked with the right people in Washington to let them know very credibly that what they feared was coming unless they behaved differently. and it worked. Now, to be sure, it didn't hurt that I had a member of the U.S. House Appropriations Committee by my side when I did it. But that was part of what they feared. And again, it really had nothing to do with USCIRF. But the experience taught me a lot, because I also learned what it takes for the US or other nations to conclude that international intervention is needed to protect religious freedom. And I think we think about USCIRF, that really is what we're talking about. I want everyone to remember what I'm about to say, because, well, according to USCIRF staff, and I heard this more than once from them and elsewhere, minorities, unfortunately, face attacks pretty much everywhere. It's a sad fact, but it happens to be the case. But what makes that something other than an internal problem, which is what you hear all the time when you try and intervene, what makes that more than an internal problem is what happens next. What does the government do about it? If it puts protections into place, laws are enforced, and so forth, victims are protected, outside parties need to let that country handle things themselves. But if the government either participates in these atrocities, does nothing to the perpetrators, or in no other legal ways stops them, then we, the international community, have an obligation not to stand by idly. And this has been an important distinction I've used throughout my human rights career, and I think it's a pretty good one, to let us know when we have an obligation to get involved and when we should kind of back off. Now, USCIRF was created under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. It was created to monitor the right to freedom of religion or belief outside of the United States, and to make policy recommendations to the President, Secretary of State, and Congress. This act, and I'm quoting from the act, this act, quote, declares it to be U.S. policy to, one, condemn violations of religious freedom, and to promote and to assist other governments in the promotion of the fundamental right to freedom of religion, and two, seek to channel U.S. security and development assistance to governments that are found not to be engaged in gross violations of the right to freedom of religion. And I really like that. As a United States taxpayer, I would not like to see my money go to support the persecution of individuals, the curtailment of religious freedom, and things like that. So, I mean, I like the idea a lot. Again, the idea is it can speak out, it can condemn these violations, and then make recommendations so that the United States gives its assistance only to nations that don't engage in these things. I think that's fantastic. I mean, it's a pretty clear statement of what it is. And when the act was brought before, was brought before the House and the Senate, it passed overwhelmingly and with bipartisan support. Something you don't see a whole lot for. So, you know, and I like what it stands for, because we shouldn't be cozying up to regimes that deny their people basic freedoms. And we shouldn't be silent or sit by idly while people are brutalized or worse just because of who they are. There's been too much of that. And unfortunately, people still are standing by while others are killed. And don't get me started on the issue of Bangladeshi Hindus and the world seemingly okay with what's happening to them. Anyway, but but in their wisdom, the United States government also did something else in this law to reduce bias. When they set up USCIRF, they set it up so that the various commissioners would be appointed by leaders of both parties. So, for instance, 3 commissioners are appointed by the president, and then 2 by the head of the Senate of the party, not of the president's, 1 by the party of the president's, and the same thing in the House, 2 not of the president's party and 1 of the president's party. The idea being that USCIRF wasn't going to be dependent on partisan politics or whether there was a Democrat or Republican in office. that both parties would be committed to this. And if you look at other bodies like this, like for instance, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in the House of Representatives, they're all kind of set up the same way. The idea, and this is a big one, is one I always talk about, this that these are issues that should transcend our petty politics. So now, according to the legislation, the different commissioners, and I'm quoting again, the different commissioners, quote, shall be selected among distinguished individuals noted for their knowledge and experience in fields relevant to the issue of international religious freedom, including foreign affairs, direct experience abroad, human rights, and international law. And I would suggest that at times they did a very good job of this, and at times they really missed the mark. Anyway, so throughout any given year, USCIRF staff, not the commissioners, but well, sometimes the commissioners, the USCIRF staff would visit countries worldwide and gather information. And each year, USCIRF would issue a report recommending to the United States State Department that certain countries be declared, certain nations be declared countries of particular concern. That is, and I'm quoting from their definition, those countries that commit systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. And when you talk to them, and when you make your case with them, they use those three terms. That these attacks, or these things should be ongoing. In other words, they're not just restricted to a particular incident. I'm sorry, they're systematic. That is, they're not by some rogue actors throughout the society, but there's, somehow they're systematic. And three, even in addition to that, they're egregious. That is, they're so awful that we have to take note of them. Now, to be a country of particular concern, or a CPC, you have to show them that all three of these conditions exist. Also, now, once a nation is declared a CPC, not by USCIRF, but by the State Department, there are a range of sanctions available to them, although I wouldn't concern myself too much with that, because, if you go back and you look at the history of this, really, almost all the time, when nations are declared CPC, one of two things happen. Either, they're subject to U.S. sanctions anyway, like they're North Korea, or something like a country like that, or Iran, or the State Department chooses to waive any sanctions on the basis of national security, and you'll generally see that with, say, Saudi Arabia. But I do like the waiver, because it allows our government to recognize these abuses without having to take the sort of action that would hurt the relationship with the country in a large geopolitical context. And I mentioned Saudi Arabia is a great example of that. And they're named the CPC every year. And we know about the violations of religious freedom in Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia is geopolitically important to the United States, so the sanctions are waived. Nigeria also is another good example, by the way. Excuse me. Okay. So anyway, what could be wrong with it? What, it sounds great. What could be bad? Well, it seemed to an overwhelming people that this wasn't just a good idea. It also was the sort of thing that we, the United States, should be doing to reach the level of moral imperative that we claim as our heritage, that we sincerely feel is who we are. I mean, after all, someone needs to stand up for people when no one else does. And someone needs to stand up for people when their own governments stand up for their brutalization, their murder, or even their genocide. And you know what? It's still a good idea, and it's still a needed idea. However, USCIRF may have started out as a good idea, and even if it remains as a good idea, but in practice, it's failed to live up to its promise. And I think that's a tragedy we're going to talk about today. This is largely because of implicit bias that has nothing to do with partisanship or whether we get commissioners from who are Democrats or Republicans. And I want to digress a moment to talk about that implicit bias just for a moment, To talk about it, it's a very innocuous way in which we see it. You see, I belong to a synagogue of very, very good people. I mean, these people truly believe in doing the right thing and truly feel for others. One day, quite a few years ago, my rabbi came to me beaming. I mean, he was just smiling ear to ear because he knew he was going to tell me about something that really resonates with me. You see, each year, my temple dedicates itself to a particular principle. And that year, he came to tell me, the temple was dedicating itself to interfaith understanding. Well, he was right. I mean, that did make me smile. That's something I truly try and involve myself with all the time. But when I read the plans for the events for the year, I turned to him and I said, Rabbi, I love the idea. And I'm very proud to be part of a synagogue that lives these principles. But to be honest, Rabbi, you really need to change the title to Abrahamic interfaith understanding. Because all I see here are Christianity and Islam, which leaves out a large number of people in the world and even in the Chicago area. And to his credit, and this is a testament to the good people at my temple, and to his credit, the rabbi did change the program. And we focused on the on the Abrahamic religion, the Abrahamic faith during the first part of the year, and the Jewish year begins in September, okay, and the non-Abrahamic faith in the second part of the year, and yeah, so we include a wide variety of religions in addition to the ones that were originally proposed. But the point was made, even among good people, we Americans often tend to have this underlying assumption that seems to credit only those faiths, who worship God with a capital G. I mean, as I said, like with my own temple, I don't think it's always based in out of ill will. I just think that's what we see around us. And it takes something to get people to move off that. But in any event, that's how ingrained I think that bias is, and it becomes something more than just an anecdote about my synagogue when we're talking about a body like USCIRF, which has a voice that's heard around the world. Because in almost a quarter century of its existence, USCIRF has never, ever cited a country for persecuting non-Abrahamic faiths alone. Oh, Hinduism, for instance, might gain mention here and there as sort of an afterthought, but only if USCIRF's major focus is the persecution of Christians or Muslims. For instance, give me an example. USCIRF has recommended that Pakistan be declared a country of particular concern 16 times out of possible 22. But if you read their reports on it, if you look really hard, you'll see mention of the persecution of Hindus, but the majority of its focus is on the persecution of Pakistani Christians. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not suggesting for a moment that the persecution of any faith is okay, or it's not as important as the other. In fact, my point is quite the opposite. You'll see all this talk about persecution of Christians, but you won't see anything about how Pakistani Hindus have been reduced to 1% of the population, or about the atrocities committed on them. Again, there might be mention here and there, but that is not the focus. It's not that USCIRF has never even mentioned refugee camps in Nepal, where more than 10 lakh Lahat Champas Hindus who were forced out of Bhutan by its government have been languishing for decades. Bhutan has never been mentioned by USCIRF. USCIRF really should change. I've told people that USCIRF really should change its name to the United States Commission on International Abrahamic Religious Freedoms, except for Jews, unless we have to include them. Because really, again, that's what their focus is. Let's talk a little bit about their record. It's not a great record as far as I'm concerned. USCIRF has been making recommendations to the State Department since 2001. Every year, it issues its Religious Freedom Report and recommends the countries it believes should be designated as countries of particular concern, or as I call them, CPCs. Now, state reviews these recommendations along with other information, then makes its final decision sometime later. Since 2001, USCIRF has made 281 such recommendations involving 21 countries. Some of them, like Afghanistan, Central African Republic, and Laos, have been recommended as CPCs only a few times. Afghanistan is an interesting case, of course, because before the war in Afghanistan, it was mentioned, and then after the U.S. withdrawal, it was mentioned again, but it wasn't mentioned during that time. I suppose it was mentioned because it was under Taliban control. Anyhow, but so Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Laos, they've only been mentioned a few times, recommended a few times. But now China, Iran, Myanmar, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, countries are no surprise here. They've been recommended all 22 times as CPCs. But year after year, the Hindu American Foundation, well, I'm very proud that I work with them too. The American Foundation documents this sort of, and I'm going to use USCIRF's words, this sort of systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom in Bangladesh, Bhutan, Fiji, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. Bangladesh, where Hindus face constant attacks allowed by or initiated by the government, and where 12 million more Hindus are not expected to survive there past mid-century. Bhutan, which has expelled most of its Hindu population and still refuses to repatriate them, return their property to them, or even allow them to re-enter the country. Fiji, most Americans ask about Fiji, they'll talk about the water. Fiji, but Fiji, where ethnic tensions and attacks on the Indo-Fijian community flared up after a coup removed the democratically elected government. Malaysia, where ISIS and its ilk have found a new home with anti-minority policies that have restricted religious freedom and forcibly relocated Hindu temples, and where government officials encourage anti-Hindu sentiment with the government's tacit approval. And then finally, Sri Lanka, where government authorities continue to discriminate against Tamils and religious minorities and refuse to respond to or prevent religious violence or harassment by non-state actors. Now, every year, if you read Hindu American Foundation's report, you will see these. USCIRF has never once acknowledged them. Not even once. Perhaps it's because their only victims are Hindus. It's certainly not for want of evidence. Now, in its defense, such as it is, USCIRF has a second tier of countries that it assesses as not quite as bad as the CPCs. But there aren't any consequences attached to where the state ignores them. It's called their special watch list. And again, it's for countries where violations are not systematic, ongoing, and egregious, but somehow only two of them. I'm not sure. It's put Malaysia on this list. I'm not sure where it figured Malaysia was not systematic, ongoing, or egregious, but evidently it figured it wasn't one of them. But I don't think the Hindu victims in Malaysia or these other countries I mentioned would appreciate the fact that evidently USCIRF thinks they should be grateful to their governments. But I want to spend the rest of this section focusing on USCIRF's behavior in regard to two countries. And I know there are two countries that have to be on the minds of many of us: India and Bangladesh. Because I think together, the way USCIRF has worked with them or treated them, I think together these two countries capture the extreme biases at the core of USCIRF actions. But although these actions come out of that same bias, I think each calls for a different response, and that's why I want to do them separately. So let's start with India. In November 2021, and this is not that long ago, okay, USCIRF took a very unusual step of issuing a fact sheet. They called it a fact sheet, which tried to justify its designation of India and other CPCs, designations that were rejected by the United States State Department. And by the way, the State Department over all these years, has rejected almost 40% of all of USCIRF's CPC recommendations. And it's really even more than that if you consider it. Some are no-brainers, like China, Saudi Arabia, it's North Korea, countries like no-brainer, they're going to be accepted. But so to the credit of the State Department, they have rejected these. And I want to read this fact sheet. It's not very long, but I think if we look at USCIRF's words, it's very revealing, and I'll talk about that. So let me read this to you. Okay, so this is USCIRF's words, not mine. Okay. In 2020 and early 2021, the Indian government continued to implement policies that impact religious freedom for members of India's Muslim, Christian, Sikh, Dalit, Adivasi, and Advasi community. I thought it was interesting how they threw those last three in, because really, if you look at what they talk about, it's only those first two. These policies include the Religiously Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA, which provides fast-track citizenship to non-Muslims from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, and in conjunction with the government's proposed National Register of Citizens, the NRC, requiring residents to provide proof of citizenship, which could subject Muslims and others to statelessness, deportation, and prolonged detention. In 2020, nationwide protests against the CIA result in deaths and destruction of property, including houses of worship, largely of Muslims. The passage and ongoing enforcement of anti-conversion laws, intermarriage restrictions, and anti-cow slaughter laws in various states throughout India undermine freedom of religious or belief. They also contribute to a climate of hate, intolerance, and fear. Government officials and non-state actors also use social media and other forms of communication to intimidate and spread hatred and disinformation about religious communities. Additional policies implemented by the Indian government to curtail religious freedom include use of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act and Financial Contribution Regulation Act to silence or restrict individuals and NGOs from reporting on and combating religious persecution, and to restrict support for religious organization activities. Religious communities and places of worship are being targeted and surveilled, and those who have advocated for justice and the dignity of religious communities are being silenced and detained. And that, as I said, are not my words. Those are the words of USCIRF in this very unusual action they took at the spreadsheet. Now, by the way, before I get into this, just one thing that's very revealing of how USCIRF does its work with really just without an understanding and information about the country they're supposedly authoritative. That the Financial Contribution Regulation Act, as many of us know, there have always been issues with what the Indian government does about foreign money coming in to India to fund NGOs and other activities. And there are a lot of regulations. Again, it doesn't have to be to an organization. I remember my own NGO opened up another NGO in India. And in fact, it had to be a separate NGO. The money had to be completely separate. And we had a good many restrictions on what we could do. And that was fine because that's the way the Indian government did things for everyone. And by the way, of course, my NGO was empowered primarily in fights to save Hindus. So the Indian government does this has nothing to do with what someone's faith is. Anyway, I want to point out some of the language that USCIRF uses. And again, remember, it doesn't usually do this. I just found it fascinating that it would take this, make the effort to do this. So first, it began with in 2020 and early 2021. This was very interesting because in all my interactions with USCIRF, in my trying to convince them about the dire situation for Hindus in Bangladesh, they always, and when I say always, I literally mean 100% of the time, told me that they would consider only information from that one specific year. Other data, they told me, could not be considered. Yet, when it comes to India and supporting a specific narrative, evidently the limits go out the window for USCIRF. Next, they refer to, quote, the Religiously Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act, or CAA. I really believe this could very well be the most telling sign of USCIRF bias. Specifically, that USCIRF is not as the fair-minded entity it claims to be, because now we can spend an entire session on the CAA and only scratch the surface. So I want to highlight just a few points and address USCIRF's anti-India bias. While there are indeed a lot of people who have concluded that that the NRC CAA is discriminatory, this is far from settled law, or an opinion on it remains quite divided, quite divided. In fact, I must tell you, I'm on the other side of that argument. The Indian Supreme Court, many of you know, refused to stop the law's implementation, nor did the Supreme Court concur with claims that it violated India's secular constitution, which is a big part of the demonization of CAA. Yet USCIRF writes blithely, as if there was but one correct opinion on this. Now, I think most people recognize that the Supreme Court of India is considered globally an authoritative body, a body that's unbiased, a body that is true to the law. So the fact that the Indian Supreme Court didn't agree with USCIRF, again, it just didn't register with them. But again, and I think this is very important because we see this a lot, not just from USCIRF and not just in this argument. People take one side of an issue and then speak of it as if it's settled opinion, as if there's only one correct way to think. And as I said, though I believe very strongly on the other side when it comes to CAA, I understand that there are different views of it. But again, USCIRF bias is very clear. There's only one correct way to think. Now, had USCIRF taken any time to read the act itself, and USCIRF does have quite a few legal experts on their staff, it would have read that the CAA applies first to illegal migrants only. This social ill and the complexity of grappling with its solution is something we Americans certainly should recognize. And we do. We do. It's a very difficult problem. And I, for years before it became as big an issue here, I wrote about how India was facing large numbers of illegal migrants that were having an impact on the nature of states like Assam and West Bengal. Anyway, but it's something that I think we should be sensitive to. But somehow, again, it applies only to these to illegal migrants, and that means it's those people who are affected by the law. They're not without any protection. But we know that illegal migrants do not enjoy the same set of protections enjoyed by citizens and legal migrants. And that's not just in India. That's here in America too. Nor does it matter how long they've been residing illegally in India. In fact, if you think about the issue of illegal immigration here in the United States, remember for a long time, when people would talk about well, what do we do about all the illegal immigrants here? The argument was not that, well, look, we should provide a path to citizenship, or we should be sensitive to the human cost. No, the argument was, well, you can't possibly deport 11 million people. So again, if USCIRF read the act, I think we would expect it to be a lot more sensitive to it, but it didn't. And as a longtime human rights activist fighting for Hindus facing violent ethnic cleansing in Bangladesh and to a lesser extent in Pakistan, when I say to a lesser extent, I don't mean that it's that it's any less violent. I mean that my focus is more on Bangladesh. Well, I certainly understand the CAA to be a method by which refugees from that brutality can find safe haven, which is the reason why I look at it quite differently. I spent a lot of time in Bangladesh and elsewhere, and for the life of me, I can't figure out why anti-CAA protesters think Muslims need special protection from the governments of Bangladesh or Pakistan. They just don't. The persecution is not about that. It's not what they face. So again, I don't think the way the law is worded specifically to be prejudicial. I think it recognizes a reality. Moreover, the law itself does nothing to change the status of Muslim migrants. It only keeps them where they are. They're subject to the same sets of laws they always were. It just provides, as usual, but it provides a fast track for those people who are refugees. In February of 2020, I wrote a friend of the court brief for one of the petitions. There are many petitions filed in favor of CAA, because there have been many petitions filed in favor and against CAA. But I wrote a friend of the court paper in favor of the CAA, and in it, I talked about what it means for people whose oppression had been ignored for decades. That in fact, the CAA is the first time any Indian government has formally acknowledged that Hindus face bigotry in Bangladesh. Now, I don't know how important that is for the people at USCIRF, but I spend a good deal of my time with the victims of that ethnic cleansing. I've seen the results of what can only be described as pogroms on the Hindu communities. And to know that the Indian government is starting to find a way to provide safe haven for refugees, I mean, it means a lot. It means, to me, that's a good thing. That's not what they say, religiously discriminatory bill. I think the fact that it recognizes a number of refugees but omits Muslims only because there's not anti-Muslim persecution in Pakistan and Bangladesh and Afghanistan. I would say that there might perhaps be a case, you might be able to make a case that that some Muslims I don't know why I'm blanking on the word. It's a senior moment. There are sects of Islam that in fact been declared un-Islamic in Pakistan, and you could do that. But in terms of Muslims in general, they don't need India's protection against Pakistan. But again, USCIRF has ignored all that and pretended that only one opinion on this exists. And I think that's a very important point. You will see this if you don't notice it already. You will see this when you talk with people who believe there's only one correct opinion. There are not that you might believe strongly in yours, but it's a refusal to acknowledge that people can have a different opinion and still be decent. But USCIRF seems to have taken that opinion and builds its argument against India on what has to be a fallacy. Well, as I said, we could take up a whole session on that issue alone. So let's move on with something else they said. And I'm quoting here. They said, in conjunction with the government's proposed National Register of Citizens, or NRC, requiring residents to provide proof of citizenship, could subject Muslims and others to statelessness, deportation, and prolonged detention. Well, I can't speak for anyone from USCIRF, but I was in Assam when there was an attempt to implement the NRC. And by the way, I didn't see anyone from USCIRF there. So they might want to be educated on this. First, someone needs to tell me why requiring people to provide proof of citizenship, especially when the country is trying to get a handle on the massive numbers of illegal migrants, is a horrendous religious freedom violation. And we're having the same debate here with ID cards for voting. Again, you could take one side or the other, but I got to know why this is a major violation of religious freedom. You know, again, people make arguments on both sides. There's not only one opinion. But again, USCIRF merely takes as whole cloth the arguments of one set of people and then uses that unsupported opinion to build its own case. Which, by the way, I want to mention something else. One of the things we see with USCIRF, and you also see it with, groups like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they go to the same sources for their information. They go to the same groups, and they get pretty much all their information from these same groups, which, by the way, is something I learned early. I can't do, and I don't. And when you get all the information from one group, what you get is groupthink. And so I think that's one of the problems here. Anyway, I was also in Assam before that, and I saw the social unrest and concern over the ongoing flood of illegal migrants from Bangladesh. And they were having terrible impacts on the state, certainly on the people. I remember parents crying, telling me how their children, when they go to school, they left. They said, "We're not living here. We're going," and they would go to like New Delhi or Mumbai or a place like that. They were breaking up families. They were changing the culture. And what a lot of people don't realize is this massive influx of illegal migrants to Assam was having terrible impacts on the environment, destroying the number of varietals of things like rice and bananas, contributing to habitation destruction that has seen the near extinction of the one-horned rhino and creatures like that. The other thing is that social problem often led to serious violence. I know I spent some time with the Bodo tribesmen on the border with Bangladesh, and they had attacked migrants, and they had migrants attack them. I was shown spots of and described the terrible things that happened. So the NRC, I believe, was an attempt to try and get a handle on this. I think, quite frankly, if India didn't get a handle on that, or won't get a handle on that, there'll be even greater unrest from the people of Assam and maybe elsewhere. So when they sought to implement the NRC in Assam, they also found, and this should come as a surprise to no one, there are real problems with the records. People had to come and show proof. People when they were definitely citizens, even office holders, somehow they were processed, and the process said, no, you're not a citizen. There were other people who everyone knew were illegal immigrants that hadn't even been there that long, and somehow they went through the process and, oh yeah, you're okay. There was a real problem with the system, and certainly with records. And again, none of us should be surprised if we know anything about record keeping in East and West Bengal and Assam, especially in the rural areas. or in areas that have been subject to regular flooding and things like that. This is no surprise. But here's the point. It was at that point, I remember being in the Silchar at that point. At that very point, the government of Assam stopped the process and started trying to fix it with the help of the population there. I'm sure it's not fixed yet, but a terrible problem. But I can tell you for a fact, that this process did not result in, as USCIRF described it, statelessness, deportation, and prolonged detention. That was not the case. People recognized that the system, was flawed and needed to be fixed. But again, somehow, USCIRF fear-mongered this to try and make a strong case against India. In fact, quite frankly, it said what could happen. In fact, I really would like to look back and see where else USCIRF has ever recommended sanctions on a country for what they think might happen or could happen, and not even comment on whether it's likely to happen. But again, all these things I'm talking about they're all part of I'm trying to give a picture of the extreme bias towards India at USCIRF. And we're going to talk about some of its implications. Although I do want to be very clear, USCIRF does not make policy, and the State Department often rejects their recommendations. Now,
Dr. Benkin, we are running short of time. Can you conclude in the next couple of minutes, please?
Oh, really? I thought, I thought it said an hour and a half on it.
Well, we will have questions and answers also, so we need time for that also.
Okay, but I'm going to skip Bangladesh then, and maybe that'll come up during the questions. But I will also say this: the fact sheet also took India to task for anti-conversion and anti-cow slaughter laws. Regarding the first, coercive conversions, as many of us know, are a real problem in India. And if USCIRF gave a damn about how things look from inside India, they'd know that. If the different faith communities would just sit down and agree on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, I think they could have some kind of working model. But again, the Christian Muslim communities are at least as at fault as the government itself. But again, USCIRF ignores history, and prior to this regime, the victims of coercive conversion were offered no protection. So again, I think all Modi government was trying to do was to reset things and look for that intercommunal dialogue. But that dialogue, I think, has become less and less likely. So one final thing I want to talk about, we'll talk about Bangladesh or other things on question, is this whole thing about anti-cow slaughter. Again, I don't know why that's a severe religious freedom problem. You can drive through Calcutta and other major cities and throughout India, and you can buy beef if you want to buy beef. And by the way, I don't eat meat, but it's, people can eat beef if they want. Or you can go to a street vendor. I have a picture of a street vendor in Calcutta, and there's a big sign that says beef biryani. And you can get all this stuff there. So no one is being deprived of something they believe they can eat. No one's being forced to obey Hindu laws. But then I would ask USCIRF one other question. If let's agree with him, if this is such a terrible, terrible thing, I want to know why USCIRF has not even once condemned those European countries that have outlawed Jewish ritual slaughter, which is an offense against our religious freedom. Oh, that's right. According to USCIRF, neither Jewish nor Hindu lives matter. Finally, I want to mention it's also important what they didn't include in this thing. Because if you look at the USCIRF's report condemning India as being among the worst countries in the world for religious freedom, it said, and I'm quoting here, in February 2020, the worst Hindu-Muslim mob violence in more than 3 decades erupted in Delhi. More than 50 people died and 200 others injured, mostly Muslims. So they said this was the worst in 30 years, but they neglected to mention that perhaps the 30-year-old mob violence they were referring to in their statement was the 1992 Mumbai riots that killed 275 Hindus. Maybe it was the murder of around 300 Kashmiri Pandits in 1989, 1990, or the subsequent mass exodus of Kashmiri Pandits that's been called the worst case of ethnic cleansing in India since partition. Even the mob arson of the Godja train killed more people than the best example USCIRF has to offer. If it can't get its basic data correct, how can we give any credence to it? So if you want to go to question, I'll just mention one thing. USCIRF has recommended 5 times that India be declared a country of particular concern. And the United States Department of State has rejected that recommendation all 5 times. It has never declared India a country of particular concern and never had to make a decision about sanctions on India. Okay, if you want to go to questions, I'll skip the rest of my talk.
Thank you, Dr. Benkin, for a very detailed talk with illustrative examples. We are sorry that, you don't have more time, but we have certain limits. So 1.5 hours includes everything, including the presentation, question and answer. And also we have a feature, we have a chief mentor, Professor Nanda, in whose name we have this fellowship training program. And generally we have a tradition that, after the presentation is made, Professor Nanda gives his expert.
See, I did not. I would have made my talk much briefer, because I really would want to highlight why USCIRF has failed to recognize Bangladesh for its ethnic cleansing of Hindus.
So let me invite Professor Nanda for his expert comments, and then we'll have question and answers. I think you are muted, sir.
Dr. Benkin and I go back many years, and I have great deal of admiration. He is a champion of human rights. He has been a pioneer, and he has given his life dedicated to the cause of human rights. So I think I don't have any comment. I simply want to express my admiration. There are many, many questions that have been raised. And as you know, AntiIndia, I have 8 o'clock on Fridays that I have to go. But I wanted to hear Dr. Benkin. And if he had continued, I was still going to be late for my next program, but I would have stayed on. So Dr. Benkin, shalom and namaste.
My pranam to you. And I can tell you that kind words from you mean so much. You've always been one of my great heroes.
Thank you very much. And please stay safe and well and continue to educate us. Thank you. AntiIndia, my apologies. I'll leave now.
Thank you, Professor Nanda.
Thank you.
We will go on with the question and answer session. And our policy is that we ask everyone to type their questions in the chat function. So I will start reading from the chat function. First question, actually, there's a series of questions from our executive director, Mr. Carl Clemens. I will try to rotate so that other persons also get a chance, but I will read first questions from Mr. Carl Clemens. In recent years, outgoing Vice Chair James Zagby recommended reform of the USCIRF. Did anything come of it?
No. I'm sorry. The simple one-word answer, no.
Okay. The next question I'm taking is from our fellow, Ripudaman Pachori, and you have actually obliquely answered it already, but I will just, for sake of formality, read it. Despite your work on Bangladeshi persecution of Hindus, why do we never see Bangladesh in the list of CPC in the USCIRF annual reports? So I guess you have already elaborated that there's a bias and it just does not come out, but any comment on that, Dr. Benkin?
Yes. And again, I will try and be brief so I don't take up, but I will say this, that year after year, because of my initial work with them, I've come to them about this issue. And I've learned from them, well, what do you need to make this decision? What is it you're looking for? And I've really tried very hard to get the kind of data they ask for. And in fact, one of the most important things is every time I talk about, I give evidence of an incident, the evidence, I give strong evidence of why, of how nothing was done about it, how no one was prosecuted, how the government gave tacit approval. I did a detailed study of targeted attacks on Hindus during the first pandemic lockdown from the end of March to May in Bangladesh. I found in a 66-day period, remember those numbers, 66-day period, 85 serious multi-crime targeted attacks on Hindus, and the government did nothing about any of them. Now, there are about 50 more than them. I didn't include them because before I include an accusation, it has, I either have to see it myself or it has to be verified by at least 2 independent witnesses, not 2 witnesses, okay? And when I structured the spreadsheet that I sent them, in addition to all the facts, I had 2 additional columns. One that talked about the international religious freedom standards, and another that explained exactly how each incident qualified as systematic, ongoing, and egregious. So I used every one of their criteria, and but they didn't do it. And by the way, at that point, that's when I figured, you know what, I've wasted too much time with these people, and I can tell you where we can get more done, because that's what I'm doing now.
I'll go on to the next question. There was a heated debate within the USCIRF on whether Israel should receive special scrutiny on religious freedom based on report of 2 unnamed clergy groups in 2017. Do you know the background of this move and what came of this?
Well, nothing came of it, because if they did that, they would face a firestorm that that they wouldn't want to deal with, that would overwhelm them. They might, because the fact is, I'm pretty familiar, because I also, besides my human rights work for Hindus, I also am very much involved in the US-Israel relationship. And quite frankly, by the way, the same groups that are anti-Hindu are generally the same that are also anti-Jewish and anti-Israel, anti-India. And yes, no, they were not able to move forward with that. And basically, those who thought they might be able to were told, no, in certain terms, you better drop this.
The next question is, will this level of bias, systematic bias, and political interference discredit the field of human rights itself in the West as well as globally?
Well, I think we have that kind of problem. We always have had that problem, because we know there are always false claims, or people will take one incident and try and elaborate it into something more than it is. I believe that my obligation in any human rights enterprise that I take up is that I have to be faithful to the facts, and I have to be able to verify them. I have to be able to show my work. I have to be able to put it in a way that people understand. And if I have credibility, then the fact that other people don't, it's certainly not that problem. And I make that point again and again, that people need to look at what I'm showing. But yes, I think that is a credibility problem. And I think the best way we do that is by discrediting them ourselves.
I'll read the next question, and this is from our human rights training fellow, Ripudaman Pachori. Have you encountered any case where you have firsthand found out any proof where Pakistani or Bangladeshi government or their proxies tried to influence the USCIRF annual reports?
The use of what?
Their annual reports and their recommendations. the Pakistani and Bangladeshi government trying to influence the process.
Yeah, except, not really, except to the extent that authoritarian governments, and we know Bangladesh, by the way, is far more of an authoritarian country than a democracy today. They generally try and structure that narrative. Now, according to USCIRF staff, our USCIRF commissioners, no, they have free and unfettered access, and that's one of their complaints about India. But quite frankly, I don't see them having free and unfettered access in North Korea or Saudi Arabia. So I would only say that there's little question that these countries do influence. I do know this. I do know that the Bangladeshi government's proxies steer people away from anti-Hindu activities. That I know, because I know people who've been involved in the in trying to get the information to USCIRF.
The next question is from our executive director, Mr. Carl Clements. What is the common pool of sources that USCIRF, Amnesty International, etc., go for their information? Do they cross-reference with each other?
Yeah, I think so. And I think if you look at, they'll go to groups, to what I call the human rights industry, the large human rights organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, maybe Oxfam or something like that. Where I don't see them going to are like in Bangladesh, the on-the-ground organizations like Audikar, like Bangladesh Minority Watch. I don't see them going to those sorts of things. I see them going to the very large ones. I also see them going to politically, religiously interested groups, and we know who they are. We know where they're. We've seen them all the time, and they'll go to these groups and accept them, and pretty much accept what they're told in whole cloth.
The list of questions in the chat function has ended, but I have a few questions, Dr. Benkin. Every year, we see targeted killings in synagogues in this country. Every year. We also have a lot of information about persecution of Wiccans and pagans in this country. Why doesn't the USCIRF look inwards?
I'm going to ask you to repeat the first part of your question again.
Well, every year there are instances in which motivated, biased, bigoted individuals enter into synagogues and start firing.
Yeah.
Which is clearly documented. Less well documented is the persecution of Wiccans and pagans in this country. Why doesn't the USCIRF look inwards?
Well, I would say that the short answer is that USCIRFs, the legislation that created USCIRF, if USCIRF's mandate is to look at religious freedom violations outside the United States.
I think that is where we come to the first premise that creation of USCIRF was a good thing.
Yeah.
I would argue that creation of USCIRF was the flawed thing. And since the creation was flawed, the product is also flawed and biased.
Let me counter that a moment, or at least modify it, because I understand where you're coming from. Because what I find problematic, and I think one of the things that I know for a fact, one of the things that India has found problematic about USCIRF is that, it seems rather like the British Raj, if you'll excuse me, to say, well, we're going to go into other countries and we're going to make judgments about what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong. And believe me, I have to tell you, I have made that argument to USCIRF. In fact, I'll tell you very briefly, in 2014, I believe there was a potential for USCIRF in India to start developing a better relationship. And so I reached out to the new Modi government and to the chair of the USCIRF and arranged we had a private meeting in Maryland, it wasn't all that far from Washington, just one day. And I had high hopes, but they were dashed pretty quickly because the USCIRF chair kept saying, you know, India is the only country except for Cuba that won't let us come in and just have unfettered access. Well, I tried to explain to them that, you know, if you look at it from the history of a colonized country, you can understand why, you know, what this, besides, it seems kind of, we're better than you. I don't think that's what it was meant to be, but I think the idea, so I understand that, and I sympathize with it. I agree with it. And I don't like the idea of going into someone else's home and saying that what I do is better. The idea behind USCIRF was not to make judgments about other countries, but to keep us honest in our policy so that we don't cozy up to nations that do bad things to people. Again, what's unfortunate is, as you say, it was flawed. It was flawed. And so in practice, that became something else. And so, Doctor, I agree with what you're saying. That's why I think initially it's a good, the reason I said it was a good idea, it's a good idea for us to keep ourselves honest. It's not about making judgments on other people. But again, as you've made very clear, that is what happens.
So it brings to the basic premise that you have the doctrine of American exceptionalism. So we shall not be part of the International Criminal Court. We shall not be answerable to invasion of other countries. We shall not let anyone scrutinize our internal human rights situation. We shall not scrutinize our white policemen shooting young black men, killing them without any due process. I think it reflects a very deviant mentality. And USCIRF is just another step in consolidation of that particular mentality. And that's why it is important that an entity which is flawed, an entity which is producing flawed and systematically biased reports, needs to be not only discredited but dismantled so that the taxpayers' money is spent on something better.
All right, a few things. It's a good argument. Good argument. And before I say this, I want to be very clear. I do believe in American exceptionalism in a different way than a lot of people put it, but I do believe that we have a role to play internationally. But I don't want to give the impression that what I'm saying is, well, we're so much better than everyone. We shouldn't be scrutinized, or we don't do things wrong ourselves. Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. So I do want to be clear about that. So what I believe is that I feel I know foreign policy pretty well. And the history of foreign policy, certainly in the West, and perhaps that's another issue that we should talk about, West versus East, has been that when America withdraws from its involvement, bad actors often fill the gap. And I believe that. And that's why I believe we do have a role that we continue to play. The other thing being, a lot of nations that would say, you have no business doing X, Y, Z, still want to take our aid, still want to take our money. We want to save taxpayer monies for USCIRF. We save our taxpayer monies for giving aid to nations that don't want us around. So I mean, I think it's a complex issue. I think also with regard to like the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that, I'll mention a couple things. One, I actually do believe I sit with. I don't know if you're familiar with Ken Burns. He's a tremendous documentarian, makes great documentaries. And because he knows American history so well, I listen to him very closely. And he believes and has said a number of times, and certainly during Black Lives Matter, during the height of it, that race has always been an issue here, and there has to be a reckoning. And I sit with him on that. What I think I would say with regard to our topic today, it is funny you mentioned that, because I have said to people, all right, let's say we're correct. Let's say we're right in going into other countries and making these statements. So how would we feel if, say, India or any other country said, look, we have a commission on racial justice, and we want to come here to assess the situation in the United States, to help advise our policymakers. How would Americans feel? Well, I think that should give us an idea of how it feels for another country if we go in and we say, well, we want to assess your religious freedom. So I think that's one thing. But the other thing, though, I would say with Black Lives Matter, no question about it, as I said, there's going to be a reckoning with race. We'll have ways to go. Being someone who's been around a little bit, I've seen over a lot of years, we tend to have these stops and starts, like the civil rights movement or things like that, where we make progress, and then we kind of coast for a while. Then there's some sort of blow up, as we had recently, and then we make some more progress. I think what I like to look at, whether we're talking about USCIRF or our own, well, but what are we doing about this? So the police officers who killed George Floyd are in prison. They've been convicted of murder. There's been a lot of soul searching, a lot of changes. That whole defund the police movement, which obviously didn't work out very well. But we're trying to do something about it. We're not just saying, oh, it's okay. Although I know there are many people here who would say it's okay. It's not. I mean, I think, I just think it's a complex issue. I think you're absolutely correct in bringing it up. And I think if we look at the racial tensions here in the United States, if we were to not have that bias, I don't think they're very different from religious tensions, say in South Asia. And these things have been significant, and they're there just like they are here. And I think it's important for us to look at that the way we'd look at our own racial issues.
So going in slightly different direction, we discussed that sometimes these human rights organizations, including USCIRF, they are cross-checking and cross-referencing with other human rights organizations, specifically Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. And you also very, aptly said human rights industry. Knowing about how Amnesty International functions, there is a lot of apprehension and suspicion that the funding conduit from Muslim Brotherhood, other international Islamic organizations to these human rights NGOs has tainted their processes. And if their processes are tainted because of Middle Eastern petrodollars coming, country like Saudi Arabia, the king of Saudi Arabia organizes an international religious freedom conference in Vienna, Austria.
Mm-hmm.
An apartheid state where Wahhabi Sunni Muslim is the state religion does not even have the courage to do an international religious freedom conference in his own country, sponsors a conference in Vienna, Austria, and invites all these people on their, the first class and business class tickets and hosts them, wines them, dines them. That kind of, pernicious influence of obscene amount of Middle Eastern money is influencing the so-called human rights industry. And if USCIRF is using the same sources, same references as Muslim Brotherhood or CARE or ISNA or things like that, what do you expect the results to be?
I would not argue with that at all. I think a couple things I want to just add to that. I have a very dear friend. His name is Dr. Daniel Pipes. He is the founder and the head of an organization known as the Middle East Forum. And he has written since the 1980s about this very topic. And I would suggest this is someone that he talks about legal Islamism. That is, whereas you might be familiar with, terror bombings or things like that, legal Islamism is, as he put it, where people will use legal means to accomplish the same goals through infiltration. But I think that that's one thing. The other thing I'll mention is that we know that periodically the Department of Justice here has been able to prosecute some of these so-called charities because of their links to terror groups. I think what's very difficult, of course, is there's so many and it's so extensive that's very difficult to do more than just get one here, one there, and one there. Certainly, the entire Middle East Studies department, at most universities, is terribly tainted, terribly tainted. So yes, and so I would agree if USCIRF goes to the same sources, we shouldn't expect anything different. And I think again that's why we see this implicit bias.
Well, I'm glad we are talking about this in a very free, candid, and open manner in a kind of academic setting, a human rights fellowship seminar training program. And on behalf of the board of directors, as well as the executive team of the International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom, I thank Dr. Richard Benkin from the bottom of my heart for yeoman's service to the cause of human rights. I think Dr. Benkin himself is one person institution whose contributions will be lauded and, eulogized for years to come. It tells you the power of a single individual.
Right.
What one person can do to further the cause of human rights does not mean my human rights, does not mean my neighbor's human rights, but human rights of people who are like 10,000 miles away. And he is working with a single, purpose, dedication, determination, firmness, professionalism. And we laud you, sir, for your contributions to the field of human rights and religious freedom. We will continue to work with you, continue to invite you in our organizational meetings, events, etc. And we thank you very much indeed for coming today, taking 1.5 hours of your time.
Oh,
and it was a pleasure to have you this evening. Namaskar.
The pleasure was mine, Doctor, and I thank you and I thank your organization for what you do. I hope that we continue to have a long and productive relationship, and I hope one day I get to talk about how USCIRF has completely ignored strong evidence of Bangladesh's ethnic cleansing of its Hindu community.
Thank you very much indeed. And with that, we are going to end this seminar, special seminar, guest seminar, for sake of wider, propagation of this seminar. This would be available within the next 24 hours on our website and on our YouTube channel, and we will be sending everyone who attended this just for sake of reference. And with a big thank you to Dr. Benkin, we are ending this meeting.
Dhanyavad.
Shalom.